The crack of a palm against flesh echoed through the Montana Territory courtroom of 1876, silencing every whisper as Lillian Jennings crumpled to her knees, her cheek burning red from Judge Harmon's strike. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth as she stared defiantly up at the man who'd just sentenced her brother to hang for a crime he didn't commit. "You will show respect in my courtroom, Miss Jennings?" Judge Harmon snarled, towering over her trembling form. Women who cannot control their tongues find themselves in most unfortunate circumstances. Lillian had dared to call him corrupt when he refused to consider evidence that would exonerate her brother Thomas. Now, surrounded by leering men and averted gazes of the few women present, she felt the crushing weight of her powerlessness. "The next time you speak out of turn," Judge Harmon continued, straightening his waistcoat with smug satisfaction, "the punishment will be far more severe." From the back of the crowded courtroom, a tall figure rose. Dust-covered boots moved deliberately across the wooden floor, spurs jingling with each step. The crowd parted as Zachary Ford, a rancher known across 3 counties for his straight shooting reputation, approached the bench. "That'll be the last time she kneels in this town, Your Honor." His voice carried authority that made even Judge Harmon pause. "Or any other. You dare interrupt these proceedings, Ford?" Judge Harmon's face reddened with indignation. "I dare to witness justice, which seems in short supply here today." Zachary extended his hand to Lillian, who hesitated before accepting it. He helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness for hands so calloused. "Miss Jennings and her evidence deserve a fair hearing," Zachary continued, his blue eyes never leaving the judge's face. "Or perhaps we should discuss your business dealings with the Wilson Mining Company, the same company that wants Thomas Jennings' land." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Harmon's face paled slightly before he composed himself. "This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning," he announced hastily, banging his gavel. "The defendant will remain in custody." As the crowd dispersed, Lillian turned to the stranger who had come to her defense. "Why would you help me?" she asked, dabbing at her bleeding lip with a handkerchief. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Zachary replied, tipping his hat slightly. "No one deserves to be struck for speaking the truth." His eyes softened as they took in her bruised cheek. "And I've heard enough about Thomas Jennings to know he's no killer." Lillian studied the man before her, tall and broad-shouldered, with the sun-weathered face of someone who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clear and honest, without the predatory look she'd grown accustomed to from men in positions of power. "They're going to hang my brother at dawn in 2 days unless I can prove his innocence," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Judge Harmon wouldn't even look at the witnesses who saw Thomas miles away when Mr. Wilson was killed. "Then we'll make him look," Zachary replied. "But not here. The judge has too many friends in this courthouse." He glanced around at the lingering onlookers. "Meet me at Grayson's livery in an hour. Bring whatever evidence you have." "Why should I trust you, Mr. Ford?" "Because right now, Miss Jennings, I might be the only friend you've got." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out, leaving Lillian to consider her limited options. An hour later, Lillian approached the livery stable with caution, her small carpetbag clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Inside were the sworn statements from 3 ranch hands who placed Thomas at their campsite when Wilson was murdered, along with a ledger she'd found hidden among her late father's things, a ledger that documented Judge Harmon's questionable financial ties to Wilson Mining Company. Zachary was waiting beside 2 saddled horses, speaking quietly with an older man who nodded gravely before disappearing into the stables. "You came," Zachary said, unable to mask his relief. "I don't have many options, Mr. Ford," Lillian replied. She was dressed practically now, having changed from her courtroom dress to a simple riding skirt and jacket. Her auburn hair was tied back, revealing the dark bruise forming on her cheekbone. "Zach," he corrected her, frowning slightly at her injury. "Mr. Ford was my father. Where are we going?" "Zach." The informality felt strange on her tongue. "To someone who might help us. Samuel Pike, he was the territorial marshal before retiring last year. He knows every judge, lawyer, and criminal in 3 territories." Zachary took her bag and secured it to one of the horses. "He owes me a favor." "How far?" "Half-day's ride to his place near Wolf Creek." He offered a hand to help her mount. "Can you manage it?" Lillian swung herself confidently into the saddle without assistance. "I've been riding since before I could walk, Mr. Zach. I'll manage fine." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I see Thomas isn't the only Jennings with spirit." They rode out of town as inconspicuously as possible, taking back streets until they reached the open country. Lillian felt eyes watching from windows but kept her gaze forward. The town of Redemption had been her home for only 3 years, since she and Thomas had moved west after their parents died. She'd never felt truly welcome among the proper ladies with their sewing circles and hushed judgments of the unmarried schoolteacher who lived alone with her brother. Once beyond the town limits, Zachary set a steady pace, neither too fast to tire the horses nor too slow to waste precious time. They rode side by side when the trail allowed, and Lillian studied her companion when she thought he wasn't looking. "You have questions," he said after an hour of relative silence. "Best ask them now while we have the chance." "Why are you really helping me?" Lillian asked. The truth this time. Zachary was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. 2 years ago, he finally said, "My brother was accused of cattle rustling. Everyone knew he was innocent kid, couldn't even rope a fence post, let alone steal livestock. But Judge Harmon had been paid off by a rancher who wanted our water rights." His jaw tightened. "They hanged him before I could gather evidence to clear his name." "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered. "When I saw you stand up in that courtroom, saw you take that hit rather than stay silent." He shook his head. "Reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you." The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file through a grove of pine trees. When they emerged into a small clearing, Zachary held up his hand, signaling Lillian to stop. He dismounted and examined the ground carefully. "3 riders," he said, pointing to tracks in the soft earth. "Passed through here not more than an hour ago." "Is that unusual? This isn't a well-traveled route." He frowned, scanning the surrounding trees. "Could be nothing. Could be trouble. Either way, we should keep moving." They continued their journey, but Lillian noticed Zachary was more alert now, one hand resting casually near the revolver on his hip. The comfortable silence they had shared earlier was replaced with tense vigilance. By midday, the landscape had changed to rolling hills dotted with clusters of cottonwood trees. Zachary led them to a small stream where they stopped to rest the horses. "We should reach Pike's place before sundown," he said, refilling their canteens. "Assuming we don't run into any more trouble." "You think those riders were following us?" Lillian asked, stretching her legs. "I think Judge Harmon isn't a man who likes loose ends." Zachary handed her a canteen and a small bundle of jerky from his saddlebag. "And you, Miss Jennings, are a very loose end." "Lillian," she corrected him with the hint of a smile. "If I'm to call you Zach, then you should call me Lillian." Their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary before Zachary cleared his throat and turned his attention to adjusting his horse's saddle. "We should move on, Lillian," he said, her name sounding different in his voice, almost like a song. "Daylight's burning." They mounted and continued their journey, speaking little but growing more comfortable in each other's presence. Lillian found herself studying the way Zachary sat tall in the saddle, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for any sign of danger or opportunity. He was different from the men in town who either ignored her intelligence or attempted to court her with empty flattery. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered in the west, promising a storm. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and stirring the tall grass that stretched on either side of the trail. "We need to find shelter," Zachary called over his shoulder as thunder rumbled in the distance. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles ahead, if I remember right." They urged their horses to a faster pace, racing the approaching storm. The first fat raindrops were just beginning to fall when a small log cabin came into view, nestled against a hillside. Zachary dismounted quickly and led his horse to the lean-to beside the cabin. "Get inside," he told Lillian. "I'll see to the horses." The cabin was small but sound, with a stone fireplace and a single room containing a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame with no mattress. Dust and cobwebs suggested it had been some time since anyone had used the place, but it was dry and would provide adequate shelter from the storm. Lillian busied herself clearing away the worst of the dust and cobwebs while Zachary brought in their saddlebags. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the roof as lightning flashed through the single small window. "Looks like we'll be here a while," Zachary said, shaking water from his hat. He knelt by the fireplace and began arranging kindling from a stack of wood beside it. "Storm like this could last through the night." Lillian watched as he coaxed a small flame to life, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. In the growing light of the fire, she could see the fine lines around his eyes and the slight gray at his temples that she hadn't noticed before. "How old are you, Zach?" she asked suddenly, then blushed at her own forwardness. "Forgive me, that was improper." He looked up, amusement flickering in his eyes. 32 this past April. "And you?" 25 next month." She sat on one of the chairs, pulling her carpetbag onto her lap. "Old enough to know better than to ride off with a stranger, according to the ladies of redemption. And yet here you are." He sat back on his heels, watching the fire grow. "Do you regret it?" "No," Lillian said with surprising certainty. "I'd do whatever necessary to save Thomas. He's the only family I have left." As the storm raged outside, Lillian spread her evidence on the table: the sworn statements, the ledger, and several letters that suggested collusion between Judge Harmon and Randall Wilson, owner of Wilson Mining. Zachary studied each document carefully, asking occasional questions about dates and names. "Wilson wanted your family's land," he said, piecing together the story. "Your father refused to sell, and after he died, Thomas continued to refuse." Lillian nodded. "Our land sits on the only viable route for a new rail spur Wilson needs for his mining operation. Without it, he'd have to transport or an extra 20 miles. She traced a finger along the edge of the ledger. "When offers didn't work, threats began. Then Wilson turned up dead, and suddenly Thomas is being charged with his murder. With a conveniently missing murder weapon and witnesses who changed their stories overnight." Zachary frowned. Classic Harmon. Frame the rightful owner, get him hanged, and the property passes to the next of kin, who would then be pressured to sell. Lillian finished. "Except they didn't count on me finding these documents or fighting back. They never expect women to fight," Zachary said with unexpected admiration. "That's their mistake." A particularly loud crack of thunder made Lillian jump. Zachary moved instinctively to steady her, his hand warm on her shoulder. Neither moved to break the contact. "We should try to get some rest," he said finally, his voice rougher than before. "I'll take the floor." Lillian began to protest, but Zachary was already arranging his bedroll near the fire. She reluctantly spread her own blanket on the bed frame, removing only her boots before lying down. Sleep proved elusive as the storm continued its assault on the small cabin. Lillian found herself watching Zachary's profile in the firelight. The strong line of his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. She wondered what had shaped him into the man who would risk everything to help a stranger fight an impossible battle. "Zach," she whispered, uncertain if he was still awake. "What will happen if we fail?" He turned toward her, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "We won't. But if we do, then I'll get you and Thomas out of the territory," he said with quiet determination. "I have friends in Colorado who could help you start over." "You would do that? For people you barely know?" Zachary was silent for a long moment. There comes a time when a man has to decide what kind of life he wants to lead. After my brother died, I nearly lost myself to grief and revenge. His gaze held hers across the dimly lit room. "But that path leads nowhere good. Helping you and Thomas feels like redemption." The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep within Lillian. For so long, she had carried her burdens alone, believing she couldn't afford to show weakness or rely on others. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to express the complex emotions swirling inside her. Zachary nodded once, then turned back to stare at the ceiling. Neither spoke again, but Lillian felt something shift between them, a connection forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. She drifted to sleep with the sound of rain on the roof and the comforting knowledge that, for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting her battles alone. Morning brought clear skies and renewed urgency. They set out at first light, riding hard toward Samuel Pike's homestead. The storm had washed away any tracks, making it impossible to know if they were still being followed. By mid-morning, they crested a ridge overlooking a small valley. A modest cabin with a barn and corral sat nestled among pine trees, smoke rising from the chimney. "Pike's place," Zachary said, pointing. "Best approach openly, he's likely watching us already." Sure enough, as they rode down into the valley, the cabin door opened and a lean, gray-haired man emerged, rifle in hand. He watched their approach with narrowed eyes until recognition dawned. "Ford?" he called out. "That you, boy?" "It's me, Sam," Zachary replied, raising a hand in greeting. They dismounted in front of the cabin, and Samuel Pike propped his rifle against the wall before clasping Zachary's hand warmly. "Been a while," he said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. His sharp eyes turned to Lillian. "And who might this lady be?" "Lillian Jennings," Zachary answered. "She needs your help, Sam." "We both do." Pike's expression sobered. "Jennings? That wouldn't be related to Thomas Jennings, by any chance? The one they're fixing to hang over in redemption?" "My brother," Lillian confirmed. "And he's innocent." Pike sighed heavily. "Better come inside. Sounds like we have much to discuss." The interior of Pike's cabin was neat and comfortable, with bookshelves lining one wall and a large table covered in maps and papers. He listened without interruption as Lillian and Zachary took turns explaining the situation, examining each piece of evidence with meticulous attention. "Harmon's been corrupt for years," Pike said when they finished. "But he's careful, never leaves enough evidence for anyone to act against him." He tapped the ledger thoughtfully. This might be enough, if we can prove it's authentic." "How would we do that?" Lillian asked. "The territorial governor is in Silver Creek for the next 3 days," Pike replied. "Man owes me more than one favor. If we can get him to look at this evidence, he has the authority to stay Thomas's execution and launch an investigation into Harmon. Silver Creek is a day's ride from here," Zachary calculated. "That would put us there tomorrow, with barely enough time to return to Redemption before the execution." "Then we'd best not waste time," Pike said, standing. "I'll come with you. Governor Jenkins is more likely to listen if I'm there to vouch for the information." As Pike gathered supplies for the journey, Lillian stepped outside to check on her horse. Zachary followed, coming to stand beside her as she adjusted the saddle. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "This has been a lot to take in." Lillian paused, considering his question. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Terrified, actually. But for the first time since Thomas was arrested, I have hope." She turned to face him. "Because of you." "I haven't done anything yet," Zachary said. "You stood up for me when no one else would," Lillian replied. "You believed me. That's more than anyone else in redemption was willing to do." Their eyes met, and Lillian felt her heart quicken. In another time, another place, she might have allowed herself to explore these feelings growing between them. But with Thomas's life hanging in the balance, she couldn't afford distractions. "We should go," she said, breaking the moment. "Every minute counts now." The journey to Silver Creek was grueling. They pushed their horses as hard as they dared, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Pike, despite his age, kept pace easily, his determination matching their own. As they rode, Pike shared stories of his days as territorial marshal, including several encounters with Judge Harmon that reinforced Lillian's belief in the man's corruption. He also spoke of Zachary's father, a rancher who had been one of Pike's closest friends. "Jonas Ford was as fine a man as I've ever known," Pike said. "Raised 2 good boys after his wife passed. Zach here took after him in all the ways that matter." Lillian glanced at Zachary, who rode slightly ahead. The set of his shoulders suggested the mention of his father had touched a nerve. "What happened to him?" she asked Pike quietly. "Died defending his land during a range war about 5 years back," Pike replied. "Zach inherited the ranch, built it into something his father would be proud of." The revelation added another layer to her understanding of the man who had risked everything to help her. Like her, he knew the pain of loss and the responsibility of carrying on alone. They reached Silver Creek as the sun was setting, a larger town than Redemption with a proper hotel and several busy saloons. Pike led them to a modest boarding house run by a widow he knew, securing rooms for the night. "Governor Jenkins is staying at the Silver Star Hotel," Pike informed them over a simple dinner in the boarding house kitchen. "I'll go there first thing in the morning, see if I can arrange a meeting." "I should go with you," Lillian insisted. "This is my brother's life at stake." Pike shook his head. A woman showing up unannounced would only make it harder to get past his staff. "Let me handle the introduction. Then you can present your evidence directly to him." Reluctantly, Lillian agreed. After dinner, exhausted from the hard ride, she retired to her room. Sleep eluded her, however, as her mind raced with all the things that could go wrong. What if the governor refused to see them? What if he saw the evidence but didn't believe it? What if they couldn't make it back to Redemption in time? A soft knock on her door startled her. She opened it to find Zachary standing in the hallway, looking equally unable to sleep. "I thought you might want some company," he said hesitantly. "Or perhaps just someone to talk to." Lillian glanced down the empty hallway, keenly aware of how improper it was to invite a man into her room. Yet the thought of sitting alone with her fears seemed worse. "We can talk in the parlor downstairs," she suggested. "It should be empty this time of night." The small parlor was indeed deserted, lit only by a single lamp left burning on a side table. They sat on opposite ends of a worn sofa, the space between them both necessary and frustrating. "Do you think it will work?" Lillian asked, voicing her deepest fear. "Will the governor help us?" "Pike seems to think so," Zachary replied, "and I've learned to trust his judgment." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But even if this fails, I meant what I said. I won't let them hang your brother." "How can you be so certain?" "Judge Harmon has the law on his side." "The law, yes. Justice, no." Zachary's expression was fierce in the lamplight. There comes a point when a man has to stand for what's right, regardless of consequences. Lillian studied him, this man who had become her unlikely champion. You're a good man, Zachary Ford. I'm trying to be, he said softly. Without thinking, Lillian reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, his fingers instinctively curling around hers. The simple touch sent a rush of warmth through her body. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I want you to know how grateful I am that you were in that courtroom. Zachary looked at their joined hands, then up to her face. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. I'm beginning to think it was more than chance, he said, his voice low. That I was meant to be there, to meet you. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibility. For a breathless moment, Lillian thought he might lean forward, close the distance between them. Part of her apart she barely recognized wanted him to. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand and stood. We should try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without exhaustion. Lillian nodded, both relieved and disappointed. You're right, of course. As they walked back toward the stairs, Zachary stopped suddenly. Lillian, he said, her name almost a whisper in the quiet hallway. When this is over, when Thomas is safe, I'd like to call on you properly. If that would be agreeable. The formal request, so unexpected and yet so perfectly in character, brought a smile to Lillian's face. That would be very agreeable, Mr. Ford. His answering smile stayed with her as she returned to her room, a warm light in the darkness of uncertainty. Morning brought both Pike and news the governor would see them, but only briefly before his scheduled meeting with town officials. They hurried to the Silver Star Hotel, Lillian clutching her carpetbag of evidence. Governor Jenkins was a solid man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened attentively as Lillian presented her case, examining each document with careful consideration. These are serious allegations, Miss Jennings, he said when she finished. If proven true, they constitute a grave miscarriage of justice. They are true, sir, Lillian insisted. And my brother will hang tomorrow at dawn unless you intervene. The governor turned to Pike. You vouch for the character of these people, Samuel? Without reservation, Pike replied firmly. And I believe the evidence speaks for itself. Jenkins nodded slowly. I agree. He rose from behind the desk. I'll issue a stay of execution immediately and send it by telegraph to the sheriff in redemption. I'll also dispatch my personal secretary to accompany you back with official papers removing Judge Harmon from the bench pending investigation. Relief flooded through Lillian, so intense she nearly swayed on her feet. Zachary's hand at her elbow steadied her. Thank you, Governor, she managed to say. Thank you for believing us. Don't thank me yet, young lady, Jenkins cautioned. Harmon won't go down without a fight. And there's still the matter of proving your brother's innocence beyond these financial improprieties. One battle at a time, sir, Zachary said. First, we need to stop that hanging. They left the hotel with renewed purpose, the governor's secretary, a serious young man named Ellis, joining their party. The telegraph was sent immediately, but Jenkins warned them that Harmon might try to delay or lose the message. Best get back to redemption as quickly as possible, he advised. Ellis has duplicate papers in case the telegraph fails. They rode hard, pushing themselves and their horses to the limit. Night found them still on the trail, forcing a brief stop to rest the animals. We're making good time, Pike assured Lillian as they shared a cold meal. We'll reach redemption well before dawn. But fate had other plans. As they prepared to continue their journey, the distinctive sound of approaching riders made them freeze. Get to cover, Zachary ordered, drawing his revolver. Now! They barely had time to duck behind rocks and trees before 4 riders appeared on the trail ahead, their faces obscured by bandanas. Without warning, the riders opened fire. Pike returned fire immediately, his old marshal's instincts kicking in. Zachary positioned himself protectively near Lillian and Ellis, his own shots carefully placed. "Bounty hunters," Pike called over the gunfire. "Harmon must have put a price on our heads." The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, two of the attackers lay motionless on the ground, while the others had fled. Pike had taken a bullet to the shoulder, though he insisted it was barely a scratch. Lillian, her hands steady despite her racing heart, cleaned and bandaged his wound as best she could. "We need to get you to a doctor." "No time," Pike grunted. "Thomas needs us more than I do." They continued their journey, more cautious now, taking alternative routes when possible. Pike's injury slowed their pace, and it was well past midnight when they finally saw the lights of redemption in the distance. The town was eerily quiet as they rode in, most inhabitants long since asleep. They headed directly to the sheriff's office, where a single lamp burned in the window. Sheriff Tanner met them at the door, his expression grave. "I was wondering if you'd make it back," he said to Lillian. "Got the governor's telegraph a few hours ago." "Then Thomas is safe?" Lillian asked anxiously. Tanner's hesitation chilled her. "Judge Harmon claimed the telegraph was a forgery. Ordered the execution to proceed as planned dawn tomorrow." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "Which is less than 5 hours from now." "That's impossible," Ellis protested, pulling out official papers bearing the governor's seal. "I have written orders here." "Won't matter to Harmon," Tanner said grimly. "He's holed up at the courthouse with several deputies loyal to him. Says he'll personally oversee the hanging." "Then we'll have to stop it ourselves," Zachary declared, his voice hard. They quickly formed a plan. Ellis and Pike would remain at the sheriff's office, coordinating with Tanner and any deputies willing to stand against Harmon. Zachary and Lillian would go to the courthouse to confront the judge directly with the governor's orders. As they prepared to leave, Zachary pulled Lillian aside. "You should stay here," he said quietly. "Harmon's desperate now, which makes him dangerous." "Thomas is my brother," Lillian replied firmly. "I won't hide while his life hangs in the balance." Zachary studied her face, then nodded. "Just stay close to me." The courthouse was indeed guarded, but the two men at the front door were easily distracted by Sheriff Tanner creating a commotion down the street. Zachary and Lillian slipped in through a side entrance, making their way cautiously through the darkened building. Voices led them to Judge Harmon's chambers, where light spilled from beneath the closed door. Zachary pressed a finger to his lips, then leaned close to listen. "Don't care what the telegram said," Harmon was saying to someone inside. "Jennings hangs at dawn. By then, it will be too late for anyone to stop it." "And his sister?" asked another voice, Randall Wilson's business partner, George Miller. "If she's smart, she'll have left the territory. If not." Harmon's voice hardened. "Accidents happen to troublesome women all the time." Zachary's expression darkened dangerously. He straightened, drew his revolver, and kicked the door open in one fluid motion. Judge Harmon and George Miller leaped to their feet, startled by the intrusion. Harmon's hand moved toward a drawer in his desk, but Zachary's warning shot splintered the wood inches from his fingers. "I wouldn't," Zachary said coldly, training his weapon on the judge. "This is outrageous." Harmon blustered. "I'll have you hanged alongside Jennings for this." "I don't think so," Lillian said, stepping into the room with the governor's orders in hand. "These papers remove you from the bench, Judge Harmon. Effective immediately." "Worthless forgeries," Harmon snarled, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Tell that to the governor when he arrives tomorrow," Zachary replied, "though I imagine he'll be more interested in discussing these." He produced copies of Lillian's evidence from his coat pocket. Miller, seeing the ledger, turned pale. "Now see here, Harmon. You said there was no paper trail." "Shut up, you fool!" Harmon hissed, but the damage was done. The commotion had drawn attention. Sheriff Tanner appeared in the doorway, backed by several deputies and Pike, his injured arm in a crude sling. "Arrest these two," Tanner ordered his deputies, nodding toward Harmon and Miller. "Conspiracy, corruption, and attempted murder ought to do for starters." As the deputies moved to comply, Harmon suddenly lunged across his desk, grabbing for Lillian. His hand caught her arm, yanking her toward him as he pulled a small derringer from his vest. "Back off," he commanded, pressing the barrel against Lillian's temple. "Or she dies right here." The room froze. Zachary's revolver remained steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear for Lillian. "You're only making it worse for yourself, Harmon," Tanner said cautiously. "Let her go." "Not a chance," Harmon sneered. "She's my ticket out of here." He began backing toward a side door, dragging Lillian with him. "Anyone follows, I'll put a bullet in her pretty head." Lillian, far from the terrified hostage Harmon expected, met Zachary's eyes with a calm determination that belied her racing heart. She gave him the slightest of nods. "You know what, Harmon?" Zachary said, his voice deceptively casual. "She'll never kneel to men like you again." Understanding the signal, Lillian suddenly went limp, dropping her weight unexpectedly. Harmon, thrown off balance, loosened his grip just enough for her to twist away. In the same instant, Zachary fired, his bullet striking Harmon's shoulder with surgical precision. The judge howled in pain, the derringer clattering to the floor. Deputies swarmed forward, subduing both Harmon and Miller while Zachary rushed to Lillian's side. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands gentle as they examined her face. "No," she assured him, trembling now that the danger had passed. "I'm all right." "Thomas," she remembered suddenly. "We need to stop the execution." "Already done," Pike called from the doorway. "Ellis is at the jail now with the official papers. Your brother will be released by morning." The relief was overwhelming. Lillian sagged against Zachary, who gathered her close without hesitation. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You did it. You saved him." "We did it," she corrected, looking up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done this alone." As dawn broke over redemption, Lillian stood outside the jail, waiting anxiously. The door finally opened, and Thomas emerged, blinking in the morning light. With a cry of joy, Lillian rushed forward, embracing her brother tightly. "I never gave up," she whispered fiercely. "Never." "I know, Lil," Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. "The deputy told me everything you did." He looked over her shoulder to where Zachary stood watching their reunion. "And everything he did." Lillian turned, extending her hand to Zachary. "Thomas, I'd like you to meet Zachary Ford. Without him, you wouldn't be here now." The two men sized each other up before clasping hands firmly. "Thank you for protecting my sister," Thomas said sincerely, "and for believing in her when no one else would." "She's easy to believe in," Zachary replied, his eyes finding Lillian's, "and even easier to admire." In the days that followed, the full extent of Harmon's corruption came to light. The territorial governor, true to his word, arrived personally to oversee the investigation. George Miller, hoping for leniency, provided testimony that not only cleared Thomas completely, but implicated Harmon in several other cases of judicial misconduct. With her brother's name cleared and their land secure, Lillian found herself facing decisions about her future. The school board, embarrassed by their earlier abandonment, offered her teaching position back with increased salary. Thomas, eager to put the ordeal behind him, threw himself into improving their ranch. And then there was Zachary Ford, who had indeed called on her properly, bringing flowers to her door and taking her for long rides across the countryside. In his company, Lillian discovered a freedom she had never known, to speak her mind without fear, to laugh without restraint, to dream of possibilities once thought impossible. One golden autumn afternoon, nearly 6 months after that fateful day in the courtroom, Zachary brought Lillian to a scenic overlook on his property. Below them stretched miles of grassland, dotted with grazing cattle and bordered by distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Lillian said, dismounting to stand at the edge of the bluff. "I can see why you love this land so much." "It's more than land," Zachary replied, coming to stand beside her. "It's a legacy, a promise." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Lillian, when I saw you in that courtroom, refusing to be silenced despite the consequences, I knew you were extraordinary." Lillian felt her heart quicken at the intensity in his gaze. "These past months have only confirmed what I suspected then," he continued, "that you are the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known, and the only one I can imagine sharing my life with." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. "I'm asking if you would do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife." Lillian looked from the ring to Zachary's face, seeing in his eyes all the qualities she had come to cherish: his integrity, his kindness, his unwavering belief in justice. "Yes," she whispered, then louder with growing certainty. "Yes, Zachary Ford, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of partnership and respect. They were married that winter in a simple ceremony attended by Thomas, Pike, now fully recovered, and friends from both Redemption and Zachary's ranch. Judge Harmon, awaiting trial in the territorial capital, was but a distant shadow on their happiness. As they began their life together on Zachary's ranch, Lillian established a small school for the children of ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. Thomas, finding a talent for business, expanded their family ranch and eventually began courting the daughter of a neighboring farmer. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset, Zachary presented Lillian with a journal bound in soft leather. "For your thoughts," he explained as she ran her fingers over the cover. "So you never have to keep them inside again." Lillian leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had found not just a husband, but a true partner, one who valued her voice, her strength, and her independence. "I never thought I could have this," she admitted softly. "After our parents died, all I wanted was to keep Thomas safe and build some kind of life for us. I never imagined that you'd find yourself married to the man who saw you stand up in a courtroom and couldn't look away." Zachary finished for her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm glad you couldn't look away," Lillian said, turning to meet his gaze. "And I'm even more glad you spoke up." "Best words I ever said," Zachary replied, drawing her closer. "She'll never kneel again, and you haven't, not once." "No," Lillian agreed, her eyes bright with happiness. "Nor will I ever need to, as long as we stand together."